a debate-oriented Socratic stage, probably fortunately for all of us. The good news is that, certainly fortunate for me, the good news for all of us is that we all have a great deal of love and passion for the liberal arts and a liberal arts education. But this is an opportunity to discuss how liberal arts in the higher ed scheme fits today, the value of a liberal arts education historically and going forward, and what it means to believe and learn and study the classics and the great traditions of liberal arts education. I want to thank Ling and Michael Markovitz, who are here tonight. They've been our generous benefactors for this program, and honored and always great to see our dear friends. President Corcoran will join us later and wrap up the program. Tonight I have two very, very different career trajectory perspectives. First, Tom Steiner. Tom was an English major at Dartmouth and is a Harvard Law School graduate. After graduating from law school, spent a few years practicing law in New York City and realized he had a different calling. He joined McKinsey Consulting, one of the foremost and early developers of business consulting and strategic business development, under Marvin Bower, who really took that organization to become the gold standard for business consulting. Tom actually had the courage to leave McKinsey and start not only his own firm, but a competitor to McKinsey. And in addition to becoming a competitor to McKinsey, he grew his firm to be as big, if not bigger, and he might argue better than his original firm. And then he later sold that company and left and is now the managing partner of Baldwin Bell and Green. He is on the cutting edge of what is going on in this country economically, what's going on demographically, and is a wealth of information on higher ed trends and as well as the value of a liberal arts education. Truly honored to have Tom join us tonight, and exciting to see hear his comments and see what he brings to the table. Next to Tom is Joshua Katz. Joshua is an awardee recipient of degrees from 2 Ivy League schools and Oxford as well. He's currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute after being a 24-year professor of classics at Princeton University. He is by study a linguist, and he will tell you that as in the study of linguistics, his passion is dead languages. So this brilliant scholar, 24 years at Princeton, sort of traded in his academic bona fides to become, candidly, I think, a culture warrior in many ways. So he has a wonderful program you can find on YouTube called How to Lose Friends and Influence People. And Dr. Katz will explain what that means tonight and how a letter on the 4th of July in 1920 altered his career trajectory and changed his life dramatically. And I would argue, and I hope all of you will, much for the better and to the benefit of American culture and society. So, gentlemen, welcome. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started. Mr. Steiner, you're up first.
Well, I wanted to put together, I'm a consultant, so I put together a few slides. Wait. So I want to put together a few slides, and so I'll share those, and maybe in the back, Jeff, you can put those up. And wanted to explain how I ended up being associated with New College. It started many, many years ago, and it had to do with, if we go to, I guess I can kind of control this. It had to do with 2 Irishmen and 1 half-Irish woman. So the 2 Irishmen are Kevin O'Halloran and of course, James Joyce. And when we came down here permanently to live, we moved down in 1990, but permanently we moved in 2000. And my mother was down here, and she went to Selby Library, and there was a James Joyce session. And so she came home and said, you know, I don't think this is my thing, but I think you might like it. So I joined that group, and that group stayed together for 20 years. It was led originally by Lola Laubheim, and then Ray Mattienzo, and then I led it for, I guess, nearly a decade. And we only ceased because we finally got to a point where we ran into COVID, and we ceased. And then we've had a second group, which I'll share with you. Now, when we were doing the reading, a number of us got interested in going to Ireland. So in 2003, we went over there as a group, some of us, and we went back in 2004, and we realized, why are we going over here at our age? The people who really ought to be going over here are younger people. So we set up a very small foundation, and we took high school students over for 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, and then we thought, it's more appropriate for college students. So we decided, okay, let's see if New College would be interested. And so we've done it, I guess, 5 times. We missed 1 year, and then when COVID came, we missed a couple of years. And it's been very, very interesting that the students stay at Trinity College. They go and see the Book of Kells. They go and see many, many Joyce sites. So that's really kind of been interesting. Now, the group in Sarasota that was the Joyce group overlapped with another group that Tom and Cheryl Walker lead, and I joined that group, and for the last, almost for me for 15 years, for them for 25 years, they've been reading a form of great books, and we particularly focused on short stories, and in the last 4 or 5 years, I can show you this, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've covered, we meet every Friday, we've covered 50 American authors, and we cover them in order. And we spend a fair amount of time understanding the history and the biographies and how it all fits together. I just wanted to point out something because we're focused on education. In the last few weeks, 5 of the authors that we've ended up spending quite a bit of time on, they're on the right-hand side, are Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Hemingway, Steinbeck, and O'Hara. They have a couple of things in common. They are all alcoholics, and secondly, and of course they are great writers. 3 of them won the Nobel Prize. What's interesting is we're here for education. None of them graduated from college. Fitzgerald came the closest, but he dropped out in his senior year. Faulkner lived on the University of Mississippi campus and only took a couple of courses. Hemingway never tried to even go to college. Steinbeck took a couple of courses at Stanford, and O'Hara never tried to go to college. He wanted to go to Yale, but never did. So, but we're here to talk about education. I wanted to try to put our reading group into a little bit of perspective because there's something in the law called qualifying the witness. So our group clearly cares about the arts and humanities and literature and history and how they fit together. And we obviously spent a lot of time on that. So I wanted to talk now about education. There's a lot of discussion about if you look at education today, of course, STEM is dominating and humanities is diminishing, and it's sort of straightforward. I want to look at it in a little bit more detail. If you go back to 1800, when this country had only 5 million people, there were fewer than 1,000 college graduates each year, fewer than 1,000. If you go to 1900, when we had 75 million people, there were still only 27,000 graduates, only 5,000 women in the whole country. If you look at what happened by 1980, the number of women and number of men in college was about equal. You can see the numbers. If these numbers are right, only about 3,000 apart. And what's happened in the last 40 years is those numbers have gone in different directions. So today there's about 2 million graduates in college, and about 1.2 of them are women, and only 800,000 are men. About 45% of the age group that would be in college go to college, get a degree, but if you look at it by men and women and break it apart, only 37% of men, 54% of women. So much of the transition that's occurring is obviously has a major relationship with gender, and it's an enormous change because women obviously are dominating many, many fields. If we look in a little more detail of this, if we look at the way the degrees actually work, so there on the left is a picture of 1970, and there's about 700, almost 800,000 graduates, and then you look at the current picture, it's about 2 million. And now we deal with the question, well, let's just start with how many people really study science. So in 1970, about 20% of college graduates had a science degree. By 2020, doubled, almost 40%. And now you got to look at that in more detail. First of all, in 1970, only about a quarter of the graduates in science were women. But today, more than half. We'll explain why in just a minute. Where is the incremental number coming from? The incremental number is in the health professions, enormous. If you look at the combination of biology and health professions, which is, of course, a code word for many, many things, it's not too many doctors. We only have 29,000 people going into medical school each year in the country, so it's a very small percentage of this, right? It's less than 10%. But if you add these two numbers together, it's almost 500,000. And so if we look at this and you step back and you say, well, the women are really the ones that are dominating this. Why do we have such a need for this tremendous increase in the medical profession? It's what I would call a problem of success, but it's a problem. And here's the problem of success. I might get this right this time, we'll see. There we go. The reason the medical profession is growing, I should say this, most of my family's in medicine. My dad was a doctor, my brother's a doctor, my uncle was a doctor, all three of my cousins are doctors, my brother's wife's a doctor, my niece is a doctor, and her husband's a doctor, et cetera. So everybody, and every time you talk to them, you say, why is this growing so much? And they always say, because, of course, the population is aging. So let me just look at a couple of statistics. Look at the number of people in the United States in the year 2000 that were over 65 years old, 35 million. If you look at the number today, you don't have 2025 in here, but it's around 60. It's doubled in 25 years. If you look at the growth rate of that, that's about 3% a year. If you want to try to figure out why it's so hard to see a doctor, it's pretty obvious. We have 29,000 doctors graduating. You have 10,000 retiring every year. That's only 20,000 more. And so and that's not even quite growing with the normal population. It can't possibly be growing at the rate of the demand. And of course, there's 80% of the demand in medicine relates to this number of people. Okay, now that's half of what's going on. The other half, of course, has to do with technology. And technology, what I'm obviously leading to is, it isn't per se that there has been the enormous decline in the humanities and no one is interested in them, although maybe we could argue that. It is that there has been a tremendous influence of science on our lives. We'll get to that in just a minute, but it's reshaping our lives. But we're looking at it on one end of the age spectrum, which is essentially health. Let's look at the other half of this now. One of the things that is going on in the world and has been going on for some time is knowledge is increasing. If you look at the time period from, let's say, 1000 to about 1500, maybe in 500 years, the knowledge doubled. If you look at a time period of, say, 1900 to 1925, maybe it doubled. The time interval has gotten shorter and shorter. By about 2000, it was down to about 5 years. Some people now say it's less than a year. This is an enormous increase in information, point one. Point two, the nodes to which information is transferred have increased enormously. Of course, everybody has a smartphone, but you also have IoTs everywhere. And so what is actually going on, and what this chart is showing, is the actual flow of information. And this is only looking at the last 15 years. So if you look at it, what's going on, 15 years ago, there was the equivalent of 3 minutes of a DVD moving for every person on Earth every day, 3 minutes. If you look at 2025, it's now the equivalent of 7.5 hours. We're just getting into the game. It's going to be more than a week 10 years from now. And people notice it in many ways. You notice the flow of information. You can't quite keep up with everything, et cetera. And we all know this, but it's having an enormous effect on us. Now, of course, there's an answer to all this, the miraculous answer. AI, it's somehow going to save us. Okay. Will it save us? Every school has AI courses. We're going to all understand it. It's going to somehow save us. Let's see what really happens. First of all, how big is the bet on AI? It's big. Half of all the increase in value, if you go look at CalPERS or any of the pension funds, New York City retirement funds, everybody looking at their own retirement, sitting there, and you go, oh, look at this, way up. Half of that increase is only these 7 companies. These 7 companies are obviously making smartphones. They have, some of them have, ownership in AI engines. Some are making the GPU processors. Some of them are doing the cloud elements of it. Some are doing robotics like Tesla, et cetera. Tremendous bet. No one knows if it's going to pay off. You could say, oh, it's going to definitely pay off. What is its effect? If you look at young people in this country today, how many hours a day are they spending on their smartphone? Lots of different surveys. Nobody has perfect information. But the reasonable answer is minimum of 5 to 8 hours. Some people say it's higher than that. And what is the effect? The 2 best-selling books in the United States right now over a long period of time is a book called Outlive by Peter Attia, who was Canadian, went to Stanford, started to be a residency, my family obviously knows about that, at Johns Hopkins, decided he didn't want to do it, dropped out, went to McKinsey, and then created a company to help people in aging. And if I can remember the essence of it, why do people die or fall apart? 4 reasons: cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and mental decline. And so, of course, he's focusing on that. So that's one end of the spectrum. That book has been on the bestseller list, the New York Times list, 90 weeks. Number 2, this book, The Anxious Generation. This is a college group. What's going on with people in college? 2 major problems, anxiety and depression. And the anxiety numbers, you can see this going up like a rocket. So, and this is, by the way, reported cases. So the number can be considerably higher. So all of this technology is changing our lives. There's no question about it. This is not really a question of just education. This is a much more fundamental question of civilization. We are shaping our civilization in a certain way, and it's being driven by technology. Well, we are not the first people to think about this. So if you go to the National Library, well, you can go to the National Library in Dublin, and you go around the corner to the National Gallery, you'll see a sculpture of George Bernard Shaw. And George Bernard Shaw said, I think at one point in time, that for every problem that science solves, it creates 10 more. And that's an essential thing. He also said, and you can see it here, you use a glass mirror to see your face, you use works of art to see your soul. What he is essentially saying is it is not science that determines what the future should be. It's we who are going to determine what it's going to be, and we have to harness the science. Obviously, if we don't do that, that's a problem. Now, I'm going to turn this over to David and Joshua here in just a second. But if you look at, this just happens to be a quick, partial synopsis of some of the classical works that overlap between the University of Chicago and Columbia, and of course these lists change every year, et cetera, so it's not quite so simple. But, and by the way, there's nothing new about this. Charles W. Eliot, who was president of Harvard for 40 years, when he was retiring in 1910, was asked by Colliers to create a list of the great books. He created the 5-foot bookshelf. Was it successful? Believe it or not, guess how many copies of those books were sold? They were sold because there were so many immigrants that came to this country that couldn't get education. They bought the books for their kids. You know how many books were sold? 7 million copies. Unbelievable, of the great books. That's what people read in 1920, et cetera. And that's been, of course, Britannica published it, which is the origin of our group. Every Man publishes it. It's published many ways. Modern Library publishes it. Bennett Cerf. There's many ways of, and we can debate, of course, what should be on the list. Just a couple of last quick points here. I don't know a lot about Patrick Deneen, but he made a comment that I like. And what he said is, I put it in bold, he said, science is not just trying to solve problems. Science is trying to transform the way we are as people. But it's up to us to decide how we want to be transformed. And that's kind of the central point. Now, one last thing. Here are two gentlemen named Marvin. On the left, Marvin Minsky. On the right, Marvin Bauer. Maybe not quite household words, but Marvin Minsky, if you study AI a bit, you may come across his name. He's called the father of AI. Of all things, he was a psychologist, and then he, of course, studied many other things, and he became, of course, one of the leaders at MIT. And he's a little bit younger than the Marvin on the right. The Marvin on the right is Marvin Bauer, who created McKinsey. So for a period of time when I was at McKinsey, I had, for whatever reason, oversight for our little group of MIT grads in Cambridge. And one day they said, we'd like to hold a AI session and invite Marvin Minsky. I said, fine. So we organized it, the word got out, and partners started calling me up and said, could I come, could I come? And finally, about 4 days before the meeting, Marvin Bauer called up and said, could I come? And I said, well, of course, Marvin. And so we had this day-and-a-half session. After the first, I would say, morning session, we had kind of a long lunch, and the two Marvins, for some reason, it wasn't a big group, started talking. And Marvin Minsky said, AI is going to take over the world. It's going to do all these things. There's nothing we can do to stop it. And Marvin Bauer said, I don't agree with that, because we are the ones who created it. In fact, you, Marvin, created the term AI itself. And so, of course, human beings are behind all this. But I think at least one of the points I wanted to tee up for Joshua and for David to moderate is, of course, how much are we going to control our future, and how much does our understanding of humanities and liberal arts affect the way we think about the future?
Thank you, Tom. You have a remarkable way of informing, of clarifying and terrifying an audience all at the same time. Thank you. Yeah, and we will certainly get back to the humanity as well as the morality of AI. On a point of personal privilege, you might note that in the event that my mom is watching this, I've been slouching so you can see the screen and my head isn't the way. I know I'm slouching, but I'll sit upright. Dr. Katz, please give us the academic side and bring your story to fore for us. Thank you.
Well, that seemed, is this on? Yes. That seemed pretty academic, too, I have to say. I'm delighted to be here. I'm always delighted to be at the New College of Florida. I'm a big fan. To be fair, I should say I'm a big fan of American higher education in general. That's no doubt a very surprising thing for many of you to hear, because there's no doubt but that American higher education is not, in general, in good shape at the moment. But it's been around in one form or another for some hundreds of years. It has been the leader in the world, and I believe that it will continue to be and will be again. That's a much more hopeful thing than I expect we're going to be saying for the most part in the next hour or so, but I would actually like to lead with that. So I was first here on this very stage this past June for a conference on the collapse of America's institutions, including academia. Yeah, okay, so there's something not very hopeful. And I was on this stage last night teaching the freshmen about the Odyssey, that is to say, Homer's Odyssey, one of the great epics at the so-called start of the so-called Western tradition. And here I am now, apparently to say something about my story. One difference between Tom and me is that I don't have slides. There are two reasons for that. Well, there are three reasons. One is I had slides for the Odyssey last night, so enough of slides. Two is we have here a McKinsey plus kind of guy versus a guy who basically likes dusty libraries in strange institutions, so I don't do slides in a natural sort of way. I think I had a third reason for not having, oh yes, I was told this morning what it was that I was supposed to do right now, namely just, riff a little bit. So let me just say a little bit about where I come from and what I think about the humanities. Perhaps the most important thing I want to say to you right now is that I consider the humanities, which is what we're now supposed to talk about, to be a very, very broad category. Because the humanities is fundamentally about what it means to be human. And while there's no doubt but that we can talk about the inhuman and inhumane possible future of AI, although Tom just teed us up to say, but no, AI is created by humans, so therefore it's humans too. We could talk about all of this, but most of the things in our world now are or are intimately connected to, well, humans. And therefore, from my point of view, a famous line, or famous if you're a classicist, which I'm sure all of you are, a famous line by the Roman playwright Terence from the 2nd century BC comes to mind. I'll give it to you in English rather than Latin, but it goes like this. A character in his play says, "I am human. I think that nothing that is human is foreign to me." So from my point of view, while I'm very happy now to talk about the humanities in the sense that most of us mean it, things like Homer, I'm also a big believer in and happy to talk about the social sciences, which are, after all, also about what humans do, and the hard sciences as well. So what's my background? I grew up in New York City. My father was a professor of chemistry, so there's science, at Columbia. He still lives on 116th Street and Riverside Drive. Those of you who know Columbia know what that means. My mother is there as well. That's the apartment that I grew up in. He taught at Columbia for 50 years before retiring. So I grew up in a very academic environment. I went to a very academic high school. I then went to one Ivy League institution for college. I then, as David said, went to Oxford for graduate school. I then went back to another Ivy League institution for my PhD, and I started teaching at yet another Ivy League institution shortly before actually receiving my PhD. So I have led a charmed life. There is no doubt about that. And one of the things that I think it's very, very important for somebody in my position to do is make clear that there have to be opportunities for people out there who have had nothing like my charmed life to enjoy all the fruits and wonders of the humanities and being human too. And there's a flip side to that, and that is that I must say I really do look down on people who are given tremendous advantages and then squander them. So I am, as David said, well, I was a professor of classics. It was in that capacity that last night I gave that lecture to the freshmen about the Odyssey. And the classics is perhaps a quintessential capital H humanities discipline. But in fact, curiously, I have no degrees in classics. All of my degrees are in linguistics. And some of the universities from which I have degrees in linguistics classify linguistics as a humanities, and some classify it instead as a social science. What I have always liked about linguistics, what I have always liked about the study of languages, is that there are scientific aspects, there are social scientific aspects, and there are clear liberal arts, humanistic aspects as well. Over the years, my focus became more and more on ancient languages, as David said, languages like, say, ancient Greek and Latin and Hittite and Tocharian and Old Church Slavic and all sorts of crazy things like that. But also, not just language as such, not just grammar as such, but literature. And it was in that capacity, for example, that I was talking to the freshmen last night, students who don't know ancient Greek. I mean, why, in a sense, would they in the current environment with the current K-12 educational system? Why would they know these things? So how do you introduce great literature, great themes, to people who can't read the original languages. Well, you can coax them into learning them, but basically you have to do other things. You have to show them that there are great themes there, that there is a great history behind these stories, that all of the subjects that are out there that are now being so neglected in favor of, well, in favor of what? In favor of so-called STEM. We can talk more about that, that all of these subjects are in fact extremely important. So I think I should stop talking now and we'll have a little bit of a conversation about why these things are important and what exactly it is that is and maybe also is not important. So let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Joshua. I as an anecdote, I will say this morning after our conversation, I asked him, I said, Joshua, how many alphabets can you recognize, pronounce, read? And his answer was a couple of dozen. So a little perspective on the potent intellect that is surrounding me here. You talked a little bit personally about your upbringing. Tom, I want to ask you to do that, and then I'll go back to Joshua. When you finish a little bit about your upbringing, because clearly you two were raised in homes that valued the liberal arts and education. But I want you also to talk about specifically about reading as young men and how that affected your upbringing and your education. Tom, please.
Is this live here? Can you hear me? Well, I did tell David this morning about a little bit, an anecdote, more than an anecdote.
Hold it.
Can you hear me now? I lived in East Lansing, Michigan from when I was very, very young until I was about 14 or 15 years old. And everybody who lived in East Lansing, Michigan, at least all the boys, had one ambition in life, which was to play football at Michigan State. We used our heads to put on a green and white helmet. Everybody had one, and that's all we did. That's all we cared about. So I would have just stayed there, probably gone to Michigan State. I didn't even know there was an Ivy League. I didn't know the names of the schools, had no interest in it. Okay, when I was 14 or so, my dad got a promotion. We moved to Detroit, and one afternoon my mother drove me over to this, I was at a public school, and she drove me to a private school, not telling me, of course, I was going to go there. And I was plopped in a fellow's office, and he said, well, why do you want to come to Cranbrook? And I was straightforward. I said, I don't want to come to Cranbrook. I have no idea why I'm here. My mother told me about this 5 minutes ago, etc. And he laughed, and we talked for a while. So I ended up being at Cranbrook, and I'd been there for, I don't know, a year or so. And they gave us some kind of test. Nobody paid much attention to it. It wasn't one that was graded. And so this fellow, McLean, who was in charge of admissions, but also college placement, called me into his office. And he said, did you look at your test scores? And I said, well, I didn't look at them too closely, no. And he said, well, why don't you look at them again? He handed them to me. He said, if you look at your test scores, you'll notice there's a difference between your math score and your verbal score. And I said, oh. I said, oh, yeah. He said, it's a difference of 200 points. And I said, oh, what does that mean? He said, I've been doing this 30 years. I've never even seen a 100-point difference. So he said, what do you read? I said, well, I do my homework. And he said, what else do you read? Well, I sometimes read the sports page. Do you read anything else? And I said, no. And he said, you better start reading. So I showed up at a bookstore. About the third or fourth book I found was a modern library book. And if you go to the back of the modern library books, it shows you all the books, all the great books, that whole list. There's 400, 500, 600. So I started reading them. And when I went to college, I could have done much better in math. I was supposed to do it, and I did fine in math, but I decided to major in English to see if I could do it. And then I went to law school and business school, but I decided to see if I could go to law school. It's harder for me to read English. It's hard, but it's a lot of work. But it changes your brain. The little I understand about it, and as I mentioned, my niece is a psychiatrist and her husband is a neurosurgeon. There's NIH articles, if those of you who know how to access them, they're not hard to find. I was reviewing one just yesterday. He's the fellow that's head of neurology at the Leahy Clinic, and he and I were looking at it. And they took about 30 Harvard students, and they put these MRI monitors on them, and then they had them read different types of works, but they particularly had them read difficult fiction, good fiction. And guess what? your brain works differently. You have something called, I'm going to call it the default function. It's not one little piece of your brain. It's an integrated piece that in several places, mostly parts of the prefrontal cortex. And what happens is when you read great literature and it's stored in your brain, when you are no longer getting any other input, which can happen obviously, when you're not seeing anything, close your eyes, not listening to anything, all that is there, and it can come back in, and that, when you read a book, that information and that process is there. And when you read a book, if you watch somebody reading a great book, they can be very, very excited because they are imagining, they are creating. That's what happens with your brain. It changes. It's very, very important. 40% of all college graduates, even Ivy League graduates, aren't reading any books at all. If you look at the Netflix numbers, their numbers are up to an average of almost 20 movies a month. So this part of the brain, this is what Oleg and I were talking about, is not being exercised. We all know this from our reading group. It's very difficult to read some of these works, but it changes your brain. So I guess that's what David's referencing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Tom. And for our students in the room and watching online, Tom's commitment to lifelong learning is represented by that list of books that he put up there. And I want to welcome several of his reading club members who are here tonight to join us. So thank you for being here and excited to have you. Dr. Katz.
Could I say something about books?
Reading books and a little more about your upbringing.
Yeah, well, so I read everything. I mean, I loved books. It didn't matter what the subject was. It didn't even really matter at a certain point what the language was. I would just work my way through them because then you'd have other books to help you do that. So I was a very, very bookish child, and I had a certain kind of tunnel vision, which served me very well and has served me very well, but has some drawbacks as well. I got this job at Princeton at a young age before having my PhD. It was the only job that I had for nearly a quarter of a century, and I was so insulated and I was so bookish myself that it didn't really occur to me the way it would have occurred to any normal person that there were all sorts of people out there of all ages, but especially young ages, who really were not reading and whose skills in basic literacy, or what I would consider to be basic literacy, which is higher than, say, what the US government considers to be basic literacy, were very, very, very low indeed. Some of you will probably have read an article in The Atlantic that came out last year by Rose Horowitz, who graduated from Yale recently. It is a devastating article about why and how kids in college, sorry to call them you kids, in college don't, and indeed at some level genuinely cannot read. And one of the morals of all of this is that it's all very well and good to pay attention to New College of Florida and to higher education. But it is increasingly clear that people like me who have spent their life up there in that system really need to spend a whole lot more time paying attention to what happens to very young kids, pre-K and then K to 12. This is obviously extremely important, and if I have another lesson to impart to everyone, it is not to act the way I did and pretend, well, you know, I'm above all of that because I'm at some fancy institution. No, 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 no. Not just your own kids, but all kids. It's your job to make sure that they go out there and read.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And now I want to jump back.
All J names are come out the same one way or another.
Joshua, thank you.
J, one of the least common letters of the alphabet and the single most common first letter of names in the United States.
Stick to Dr. Katz. So this is a great lead-in to the controversy of higher ed. We've established, I think, Mr. Steiner, Dr. Katz, David Rancourt, that we are all believers in higher education. We are all passionate about it. We make a living in it, two of us, or you did?
I did.
And on July 4th, something in 2020, something happened remarkable in a bad way, I would argue, or at least in a controversial way at Princeton. And then last year, a few Ivy League presidents stood before Congress and made some testimony that drew a whole lot of attention, critiqued probably more than supported. And then there was a lot of fallout from that, and then what happened at Columbia and a few other places unfolded. We're all very well aware of this. And let me say clearly that New College, Florida has not escaped its own attention on this piece of this fight over higher ed. Higher ed is innately political because a lot of money from government goes into higher ed. Many would argue that it's unduly influenced by politics. That is a great debate for another day. Talk to us, Joshua, if you will, talk to us about what happened on the 4th of July in 2020, your reaction to it, what moved you to your reaction, and then what happened after, and just walk us through that. It must be a fascinating part of your life. We want to hear about it.
Yeah, well, you know, how many hours do you have? But that's not the way to tell any story. Look, in July 2020, as all of you know, was a very, very bad time in this country and a very, very bad time in the world. And for whatever reason, mild-mannered, super academic, uninterested in politics Joshua Katz snapped. A lot of people snapped in a lot of ways in 2020. We all know that. People on the left snapped, people on the right snapped, everybody snapped. But I snapped very, very specifically in the first week of July 2020 when 350 plus of my colleagues at Princeton, that's a very sizable percentage of the faculty, signed a completely insane, not completely insane, but very largely insane letter of demands and requests, something like 57 Heinz varieties of demands and requests in the name of anti-racism. Some of these requests were perfectly reasonable. Many of them were contentious. Some of them were illegal and or immoral. And for whatever reason, I decided I'd had enough of this, and so I wrote under my own name, with nobody else involved, a dissent. What I wrote was, I believe to this day, almost 5 years later, extremely mild, extremely measured, in any other time, really not very interesting at all. You can go and read the original letter that I was arguing against. Readily available. You can read what I wrote. It's readily available. You can see what you think. The consequence of my writing 1,500 words or whatever it was that within 12 hours, my life as I had known it was completely over. I lost 99+% of my friends. I am not exaggerating. That means that 99+% of the people who had ever spoken to me and regularly spoke to me, because in fact, believe it or not, I was liked, stopped speaking to me from one day to the next and have never communicated with me by phone, text, email, pigeon post, smoke signals, or anything else ever again. So I committed a major sin, but I don't think I committed a sin at all. I think I wrote something that was absolutely necessary at a crazy time. Well, life has never been the same. On the other hand, my life is now much better than it was. I am not convinced that life is better. In fact, I think it's worse for almost all the people who signed that letter, because almost all of those people are still professors at Princeton and places like Princeton. And let me tell you, you don't want to be a professor at Princeton right now. You don't want to be anything at Princeton right now. The place is a mess. Again, I started today by saying that I'm optimistic about American higher education, and I am. And I believe that Princeton will rise again too. But right now, in 2025, Would I rather be at Princeton or outside Princeton? Despite my upbringing, despite everything I told you about what I was, what I stood for, and what I wanted to be for the rest of my life, I'm much happier being here right now.
Well, and certainly led to an opportunity to be a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and to become probably several awards for freedom and other things. You became a rock star about freedom. It's a remarkable event.
Let me tell you, the first time I won one of these awards, one of the few people at Princeton who still spoke to me said, I invited him to the award ceremony. It was a very small award ceremony because it was in July 2020, so we all had to be 6 feet apart and wear masks, and there could be no food, and you get the idea. But he said to me, you know, well, you didn't really want to win this, did you? No, I didn't really want to win this. It would have been a lot better if I had never done anything, except no, that's not true. It's much better that I did it because although it was very painful and still has certain painful consequences, I believe that what I did was right, and I believe that in the end, the result of that will be better for Princeton and will be better for higher education in general.
As Teddy Roosevelt might say, welcome to the arena, my friend, right?
Here we are.
I will compliment our faculty present here tonight and our president, who is also here. New College has made a commitment to intellectual diversity and also to recommitted to civil discourse. Not that it wasn't always present here, but those values pervade this campus, and we take it seriously, and our students take it seriously, and it's an important element to campus. And we certainly don't all agree on a lot of things, but we find outlets to solve those, to resolve those in respectful fashions, and get results in the end to make the school better. So that's a telling tale there, and there's a lot more to it, but thank you for sharing that with us. Tom, if you would, same sort of occurrences that you witnessed. You're an advisor to amazing companies and likely to higher ed institutions. Your client list is confidential, so I'm speculating. What would you say when higher ed sort of blew up last year and over the few years? What would you advise a college president how to handle it? How would you advise a college president to maintain the good things they have, but to find that way back to peace on campus and whatever else you think should be the answer? What's your answer for it?
Wow, that's way above me. I have not dealt with that one. I would like, though, to deal with this issue we're talking about, where you have two sides to a discussion. And it deals with something that happened in Sarasota. It's kind of a story. So Pineview is one of the schools where we had students that went to Ireland. And so one day we were going to go down to Pineview and see the students in the 12th grade class. We had a fellow from Ireland with us. And I, of course, was doing so many things I'd forgotten to tell Kevin O'Halloran about this. And so about 15 minutes before we were leaving, I said, oh my gosh, I haven't called him. So I called him. We were dressed in suits, and Kevin was dressed like a busman. And so we picked him up. We went down there, and we had our classes. And afterwards, the senior people were there, and they were kind of ignoring Kevin and treating him, and I didn't think quite the right way, but, you know, the way he was dressed, they didn't quite understand it. And so I said, well, do any of you know about Frank McCourt? And they said, well, we do. I said, do you remember the story where Frank McCourt has, there's a class going on, and all the students are supposed to write a poem. And so the teacher's looking through the poems, and he gets to one of them, and he says, "Aye, lad, would you come with me? We've got to go see the prefect." So they go down the hall, and they look at this poem, and the prefect looks at it, teacher's looking at it, and they say to the student, "Where did you get this? Frankie, where did you get this poem?" He goes, "I got it out of me head." And he goes, "No way you could have gotten this poem out of your head." And so they go on like this for a couple of minutes, and then they say to Frankie, because they get frustrated with him, "Well, Frankie, if you got it out of your head, go on next door and write the next stanza." So he disappears. And he said, "I may not be inspired." He said, "Well, do the best you can, Frankie." Comes back a couple of minutes later, and he's got the next stanza, same verse, everything's rhymed. He's built the prefect and the teacher into it, etc. So the teacher prefect says, Frankie, go back to class. And then the teacher says to the prefect, let me do something with this boy. And the prefect said, you better, because it only happens once in 10,000 times. Well, that teacher, and this is what I told the people at Pineville, that teacher was Kevin's father. His name was Tom O'Halloran. And as I got to know more about Tom O'Halloran and as I got to know Frank McCourt better, Frank McCourt said this is what he would do in his class. On a Monday, he would give us a topic and tell us to write something on it, and we did on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, he would present a devastating argument in favor of it. And everyone went home kind of shattered and said, wow. On Thursday, he would come in and he would again present a devastating argument on the other side. And then on Friday, they would talk and they'd say, what did you learn from this? And what Frank McCourt said, what I learned is there is always two sides to every story. He was the only teacher we had who taught us that. And I think that's the central proposition. It has to be true. It's very hard to remember that because we have so many forces that make us not want to think that way. But the truth is there are two sides to every story. And of course, now I don't know exactly how I would possibly advise the presidents of these universities, which were, you know, they were up against a wall. You know, I have no, that's beyond me.
Well, Maureen, I will note that he's clearly an amazing professional, and I learned this as a consultant myself, that you never give away free advice that you can get paid for. So congratulations there. But anyway, well done. But a great answer nonetheless. Thank you, Tom. I have immense respect for both these men, so it's fun to joke around with them as well, so thank you. Shifting gears or going a little deeper into higher ed. Costs of higher ed have risen precipitously, aligned, as most graphs you will note, with enhancements of federal financial aid, a criticism of higher ed. In Florida in particular, we've had many state leaders that have pounded the STEM drum, and while STEM certainly includes the sciences and the math and the liberal arts colleges, the engineering seems to be, and the coding seems to be the primary focus of these advocates for STEM. And as well now AI. So STEM, AI. And where does that leave the liberal arts? There is great uncertainty in this world. Politically, there's uncertainty in the business climate. If we forget about the liberal arts and we're only focused on coding and engineering, and AI replaces all of that, how do we get back to the roots of the liberal arts and not lose our way as far as higher ed goes? Because I don't think we're back there yet as a country. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's of course the large question. I don't have a good quick answer to that one. I don't think anybody does. I will say that everybody should care about the future, and STEM is, I think, largely about the future. Of course we have to care about this, but in order to know the future, not know the future, in order to shape the future in a good way, it seems to me obvious that you have to pay attention to the present. And if you're going to pay attention to the present, then it seems to me very clear also that you have to pay attention to the past. I don't mean here that you have to pay attention to, say, what happened in Greece or Egypt or China 5,000 years ago. You just have to know something about what happened 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 20 years ago. I mean, look, if you've been in a college classroom, you will know that current students have no real understanding of, say, 9/11. For those of us of a certain age, that's just utterly remarkable. But of course, this pattern is always there. 20-some-odd years from now, people are not going to know about October 7th in the same way that we do now, the way, say, a certain December 7th of a bygone generation has now also, for many people, disappeared. This is not good. You've got to know something about yesterday in order to know something about today, in order to make things work for tomorrow. And that, at the very least, is an argument for studying history, a subject in which the number of bachelor's degrees between 2008, when there was a big bust, there were 34,600 plus BAs in the United States in history that year, and 2017, 10 years later, when it was 24,200 plus, a 30% drop in 10 years, and it's gone down even more, of course, unsurprisingly, since 2017. I mean, this is just not good, and that's just a question of history, never mind, say, philosophy or various language arts, right? If you can't communicate with people, if you don't know the right words to use, if you don't know the right tones to use, if you don't know the right gestures to use, if you haven't read this style and this newspaper and that magazine and this epic poem and this novel and this piece of journalism and this piece of criticism, if you haven't been exposed to a very wide range of material, at least just from, say, one generation before, if not 10 generations or 30 generations before, you're just not going to be able to do a good job in life right now and in the future. You know, that sounds very pie in the sky. I understand that. Saying that doesn't then make people, or the right people in enough numbers, want to take those classes. But I guess one just has to keep banging at that door and hoping that people will listen.
Thank you. And Joshua, and from Tom's perspective, uncertainty in the business world and your interaction with Fortune 500 CEOs who maybe in some cases think they know what's going to happen and you have to dissuade them to look at other things. What is your message on this, in tying in reading and history and all of that? What's your perspective?
Well, first of all, I think that the underlying theme that we're talking about here is this bias for recency. That's a mental thing that's going on. And I'm going to get to your question, but if you look at let's just try the history of the universe for a subject. If you take 13.8 billion years and just analogize it to a line going from California to Sarasota, a billion years, the last billion years would be from about Gainesville to here. Human civilization is just, not even civilization, just our race, is just the last 250 feet. Your lifetime is less than an inch. This entire history since we came to this, from the Europe, we came here, is only 4 inches. And now we're debating within that inch, how much are we going to read? So there are many, many problems, but there's some deep ironies here. And let me just I will get to your point. But one of the deepest ironies is information has never been more accessible and never more accessible at a lower cost. But somehow education is very expensive, which seems, how can that be? It's because it's not about the materials. There was a head of Ford Motor Company, his name was Jacques Nasser, and he decided, which was a very noble thing, that he worked with the University of Michigan, and he said there are many people working in our Ford organization, 250,000 people in Ford, and 80% of them didn't have a college education. He worked out a whole series of courses long before we had open universities, and he gave them all computers. And he said, all of this education is now going to be available to you. Within 6 months, there were little shops set up outside the Ford factory, and they were buying the computers and reselling them, okay? A low single-digit number of people actually took any of these courses. What you learn when you study all this is what encourages reading is 2 things. One, they're both important. One is some kind of teacher, and 2 is a very strong peer group. And you see that over and over and over again. Now, with respect to the leaders, it's very, very difficult when you lead these large corporations because you are very much forced into this near-term immediacy. And so the way you get away from it, which is difficult, is to try to think forward for some period of time. It's very, very difficult to do that. I date myself with this example, but I ended up, when I was at McKinsey, working for a period of time with Kodak, with 3 different chairmen, with Walt Fallon, Colby Chandler, and then a guy named, I think, Clayton. Can't remember his first name. And we kept talking about the way the digital world was going to come eventually. But their focus, they said, we make so much money on what we're doing, so much money on what we're doing, so much money on what we're doing. I'm working with somebody now who is probably going to be one of the 2 or 3 youngest CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. And what we're doing with him is we're building a picture of what 2050 looks like. Because you have to think in longer term time frames. It's easy to be trapped in immediacy because we have all this information coming at us. It's very difficult. You have to go off by yourself. You have to change your brain structure. I think what Joshua is demonstrating, and he's humble in his way of saying it, he basically said, how could you fail? I'm living right next to Columbia. I've got professors. I can go to Butler Library. I've got every advantage you could possibly have. Of course, I'm going to be able to read Latin when I'm 5 years old. But very few people have those advantages. But the point is, it is more and more and more difficult to have this long-term thinking. And it's a huge problem because you have no perspective. So it is very difficult to get CEOs to think this way because they are living quarter to quarter. They have so many problems. Their time is so chopped. When you try to get on their schedule and when you have to keep getting on their schedule, it's always, we can't get an appointment for at least six weeks, but then you can have an appointment. So it's very difficult. It's hard, but it is absolutely true, in my view, that the CEOs who are able to think longer term have an enormous advantage because they can see that the future is not going to be shaped by a series of lockstep, this budget, next budget, next budget, next budget. If you're going to change a school, if you're going to change a company, you have to form your view of what you're going to change it to, and then you notice when you try to implement that, it torques against the operating plans because you start going, oh, but if we go 1 step forward, it's not quite going to get us there, and then you have to change. It's very hard to do. Very hard to do.
And statistically, 40% of those C-suite CEOs have liberal arts education. So they are prepared for that long view to think strategically. And our president frequently says, our goal here is to not only educate our students for their first jobs, but for their last jobs. So thank you. This is a great example. I want to ask you, if you would, to do me a favor and put on an admissions recruiter hat for a minute. And I'll give 2 examples of personal friends that I have, conversations I've had with them. One of them is a very well-educated energy trader, very successful financially, who has several kids, and he told me once that rather than give my kids a college education, I'm going to give them $250,000 each and tell them they can start a business, they can go to college, they can go to grad school, however they want to use that money. I have another friend who's a very successful contractor. About halfway through his college degree, had some personal circumstances where he washed out and never finished, and has built a remarkably successful big contracting company and has a few kids, and has told me that it is his desire to give the company to his children or make them earn it, but he wants each of them to have a college degree simply so they don't have to deal with the stigma of telling their friends they don't have one. And it isn't that he has this great passion for the liberal arts or higher ed, but it's a very fair perspective, and he's very honest about it. I also pointed out to him that he reads about 4 books a week, so he's not a fair example of someone who doesn't appreciate an education. He's self-taught. What would you say to a parent like that? If you were a recruiter, why is it worth the money? Why is it worth the time? Life is a marathon. Why is it worth the time at this age for your son or daughter to go to college, get a great liberal arts education, in lieu of just going to work and becoming a plumber's apprentice, where some of these jobs pay pretty well today? What's your thoughts?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that it's not true, and this is a real change of the past couple of years. It's not true that there is that same stigma. I mean, right now, if you say that you have a degree from Harvard or Columbia, a whole number of people who a few years ago would have said, oh, wow, that's amazing, you must be wonderful, look at you and think, you know, what the heck were you doing? What the heck were your parents doing sending you to schools that have gone completely crazy? So I don't think that that's going to be the long-term answer here, but in fact, I think things right now are very much in flux. I had phenomenal teachers. I mean, I had so many wonderful, wonderful teachers in college and in grad school. And these were people who, I will get to this in a roundabout way, these were people who commanded great respect from me and from other students, but with whom it was also possible regularly to play, right? That learning was fun. It was not antagonistic, or if it was antagonistic, it was fun jousting in the classroom and everybody enjoyed it. And I think, I like to believe that these wonderful teachers and professors that I had some respect for me and the other students too, and enjoyed playing and jousting with us. Right now, that relationship at many colleges and universities is utterly gone. The main relationship right now appears to be fear, and it's fear that the faculty has for students. This is very, very, very bad news. And I think at a small, intimate place like New College, where interaction of a very personal sort is prized, I think that a place like this is in fact very much the answer for where we need to go. So what would I say to these parents? Look, education is not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. And one of the problems in America generally, educationally and otherwise, is homogenization. Not politically, but all sorts of institutions are all tending in the same direction. So it used to be the case that there was a real difference between Harvard and Wesleyan. And there was a real difference between Wesleyan and Florida State. And there was a real difference between, I can go on and on and on and on. But increasingly, places want to be very much the same. It doesn't matter whether they're in cities or in rural areas. It doesn't matter whether they're big or small. It doesn't matter that they're, places that are famous for this subject versus famous for that subject. They're trying over and over again all to cater to the same common and often relatively low denominator. So what would I say to parents? I would say this. I would say, sure, if you're going to send your kid to college, and I believe in sending your kids to college if they want to go to college because I am bullish on higher education in the broad sense. If you want to do this, you have to pay real attention to what the options are out there and choose accordingly. Because some kids belong at this kind of institution and others belong at that kind of institution. And you just have to be able to figure that out. So my answer is, look, if you want to go and make a lot of money as a plumber without going to college, I think that's great. I mean, we need plumbers, and believe me, I am renovating a house right now, and I know very much how difficult it is to find plumbers. It's much easier to find PhDs in the block around me than it is to find plumbers, and that is not a good thing. But still in all, I think whether you want to be a plumber or you want to be a professor, it's in general a good idea to have a good education. But different people are going to have different ways into education, and the most important thing here is to pay attention to what any individual specifically needs or would appear to need.
David, could I comment on that?
Please, yeah.
Well, I think the elephant in the living room in this discussion is the job market. And I know something about that because I think if I look back, I guess I've had my own firm for almost 30 years. I've probably hired at least 500 Ivy League graduates. And if you look at the job market today, it's gotten increasingly specialized. At a board meeting that I was at in New York about, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a fellow I sat next to runs financial institutions for Morgan Stanley. And we were talking about recruiting. And he said we recruit from 5 colleges and 4 MBA schools. He said the MBAs we interview before they start. He said, of course, it's not ideal, but that's what all our competitors are doing. We have to do it. They interview in their junior year, the spring of their junior year, junior year for the college students. And so, of course, there's this tremendous effort by the students that understand the salmon ladder to make sure they've taken all the economics courses, et cetera, et cetera. Let me go back to the 500 people. The 2 best consultants, I think, that ever joined our team were both art history majors. They both went to Princeton. The second one was rejected and was almost out the door when I saw what was going on, and I went and found this woman, had her come back into my office, and I realized that she really had enormous talent. And I want to go back now to Marvin Bauer, who knows something about people, because he was actually, in addition to going to Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School, he was a psychologist. So one time, when I was doing recruiting at MIT, Marvin called me up. We both lived in Bronxville. And he said, would you mind if I came with you and went up to do recruiting? And so I said, fine. So in the old days, you didn't have TSA, so you get up in the morning and not too tough. You get the shuttle and you're up there and you can be there for a 9 o'clock interview. Not so difficult. So we interviewed between 9 and noon, and then we compared notes. And of course, you can tell by my behavior, I'm not that good a listener. And so Marvin said, what'd you think? And of course, I'm telling him everything I thought, and finally it dawned on me, he said, oh, Marvin, what did you think? And so Marvin said, well, let me tell you what I found out. He said, when I do my interviews, I don't ask them about their grades. Of course, I'd repeated all the grades to everybody. He said, I ask them if they have a hobby. And he listens. And he said, I only let them talk for 3 or 4 minutes. And then I ask him, do you have a second hobby? And so he said, not as many do, but some do. Then I said, without too much direction, I ask them about their parents. And then I listen and see which one they pick. And then I ask them about their second parent. And I'm listening to Marvin. I go, Marvin, where are you going with this? And he said, what I've found is when you have people who have a wide range of interests, it can be reading, it can be hobbies, and you have parents that are somewhat diverse from each other, the chances of finding people with imagination are much higher. Now, we've studied 50 American authors. Tom and Cheryl are sitting in the front row, and they know that we have a 30 or 40-page presentation we do every Friday. And when you look author by author, and we're now doing, who are we doing? I forgot who we're doing. Updike, John Updike. His parents are totally different from each other. Couldn't be more different. And you see this phenomenon over and over again. What's the problem in the job market? I hate to say it. The employers are stupid, okay? Because I've seen it in my own firm. They do not know what they're doing. They're following, and guess what? It's automated. It has to be, because with the E-structure, they're getting, 8,000 resumes. And so we're dealing with something really stupid, because you're sort of saying, my choice is I come to college, I gear myself up for this one track. I actually haven't done anything to improve my mind more broadly. I got the job at Goldman. And you go and work at Goldman for about 5 or 6 years, and guess what? You're bored to death. You don't learn anything. You have no lateral movement. Or you can go to do the same thing in medicine. All these fields are highly specialized. It is a huge problem. It's what I was trying to say earlier. The problem is not per se education. The problem is civilization.
Yes.
It is a big problem. But it does not ever mean that these 2 people who were the art history majors, who both of them are, very, very broadly trained. They know literature, they know music, they know all kinds of things. They are phenomenally good in economics too. They have all these skills. Broad skills are always better, but the hiring system is warped, and so it's a problem because the parents come in and go, Bowen was the president of Princeton. Boma was an economist, I may have the names reversed, at Columbia. And they wrote a book called The Economics of the Performing Arts or something like that, 40 or so years ago. What they were explaining was why the labor component of the arts, including education, will go up and up and up relative to everything else. Why is it so expensive? It's not that the budgets aren't well managed. It's because if you go to Ford Motor Company and you watch it year by year by year, fewer and fewer and fewer employees build the same number of Ford cars. And the same is true for Honda and Toyota, et cetera. But if you go to a university, it's not true. The ratio stays the same. And therefore, it's bizarre. You have to really think about it and see why it's working. It inevitably gets more and more expensive. When we studied this, we studied it, we had a whole group of, we studied education, we went to Ford. In the process, one of my partners had been at Oxford, so there's one fellow at Oxford for one of the colleges who's in charge of all the colleges for the economics. And so he came and sat in our office, and we spent 3 or 4 hours one afternoon. He was in New York. And we were talking about the costs, and he said, you know, if you look at the 1930s and 40s and maybe even into the 50s, you had the world expert, you know, Bullock, for example, for you know, studying Russia or Hitler or Stalin, et cetera, Alan Bullock. You can go down the list. We had Trevor Roper, every single one of the world experts, one-on-one teaching. Then what happened is next level of teachers, still one-on-one teaching. Then 2-on-1. He said the proposal we're looking at right now, in order to make our numbers work, is 5-to-1. And this is a really big problem. You cannot really learn without that level of instruction. So Joshua had a charmed life because you actually were exposed to all that those people. But we don't have that for most people. It's very difficult. It's very difficult.
I mean, look, the best colleagues in any job and any environment that I've ever been in, and I bet all of you pretty much will say the same thing too, are people who have very wide interests. They may not have grown up with all sorts of privileges, but they do have hobbies. They do care about music. They do like to cook. They do like to read something outside whatever it is their job might be. And time again, I have seen that those are the people who do the best in the job they're actually supposed to do. These are the people who also do on the side all sorts of things that are not directly related to what it is they do. I had breakfast yesterday in my hotel, and next to my wife and daughter had already gone off to the beach. I was sitting there working away, as is my wont, and the man at the next table was on a Zoom call. He obviously makes a lot of money doing I'm not exactly sure what, and he was bragging in a very loud voice about the fact that he receives all of these CVs and he shoves them into some sort of AI machine. He has, 700 of them or something like this. And the machine has some great algorithm, and it gives him then the 10 best candidates. And then, it's amazing. All I have to do is read 10 applications. I mean, this is absolutely the way to go. And I wanted to get up and strangle the guy. I mean, this is an unbelievably stupid way. First of all, you shouldn't be bragging about this. You shouldn't be bragging about this in a public place, especially if you're running a public company, which he may or may not have been. I didn't actually figure that out. But are you kidding? I mean, there's no way that that is the best way to get his people. And I hope he finds that out the hard way.
David, could I just comment on that?
Sure, and then we've got about 10 minutes left for questions, so I want to make sure we have time for that.
So when I left McKinsey, with a group of around 25 people, we, of course, went to the same campus as McKinsey did, and we were trying to recruit the same students. And it's a little bit challenging, right? Because we didn't exactly have the pedigree of McKinsey. We'd all been there, but it wasn't identical. So somebody came up with the idea, and this is what we did. And a number of us, for whatever reason, had read quite a bit in English. So we'd read the Greek dramas, we'd read Thucydides, Herodotus, et cetera, gone through all of that. So when they came, instead of having normal recruiting, we actually had it at a country house. And we had about 25 people. And they showed up for the weekend, and the whole theme for the weekend was we're going to talk about Greece. When they walked in the door, they were put in a toga. Greece and Rome.
That's Rome.
And so they were put in a toga of a certain color. They sat at a table, and then we showed the first 18 minutes of the of Romeo and Juliet. I can't remember. No, not Romeo. What am I talking about? Of Julius Caesar, and we stopped Jason Robards, and Jason Robards, of course, is help me out, guys, Brutus, and so we stop it after 18 minutes, and we said, okay, there's Brutus. He's your client. Advise him. He's trying to figure out whether to join the conspiracy. Okay, and then we went through the whole weekend on this. Of the 25 people, 24 joined us, right? People have a thirst for this, but you have to have somebody kind of making it happen. So it can happen, but it can't happen. You see, what the essential point is that Joshua was making, and it's the problem with AI. There's no substitute. There is no substitute for hard work. There is no substitute for hard work. Doing the real work that Marvin Bauer did to figure out who the really good people are, that's what's important. And you can't get it from some AI algorithm.
So we have an audience filled with people that could do their own Socratic stage, I think. I would respectfully ask the audience and our panel to be brief so we can answer several questions tonight here. So, Jeff, please, we'll go from this side to that side. Yes, sir.
So I feel like in this discussion, there's almost, or implicitly almost, like two different definitions of education. One is maybe one that we come in with thinking it is bettering oneself, bettering one's mind. But in practice, what so much higher education does, it feels like it is a machine for job placement and also a machine for elite production, where it is a implicit social contract to say, hey, you go to this school, you go to Harvard, you're going to be okay. People will respect you. And I think that is, such a loss. But you know, when we look at the numbers of how many people go to college, like I imagine such a huge percentage of those people are just doing it to get a job. It's just to get a job. And that seems so terribly ineffective. What do you guys think about the role of higher education as just a machine for job placement?
Well, what do I think about it? I mean, you're of course, broadly speaking, right. You know, the funny thing, you don't really want me to give a personal answer, but I'm going to punt and give a personal answer, and that is that since my desire in going to college was to teach at a college, for me, it's all wrapped up in the same thing. But of course, that's an extraordinarily elitist sort of answer, and I recognize that. And again, to pick up on something I said before, I was so naive in a certain sense when I was young that it didn't really occur to me that my classmates, that I had many classmates who were perhaps using this just as a job market machine. I also think it's much more true now than it was then, but still in all, I think I was blind enough to this side of, frankly, normal life that it makes it very difficult for me to give a non-funny answer to your question, which I think, however, is an extremely good and extremely important question.
Well, first of all, there is a problem, right? The problem is if you didn't go to one of the 5 colleges that Morgan Stanley's recruiting at, you can't get a job at Morgan Stanley. So that's a real fact. And so that's why you have this kind of behavior. When I went to school, it was a whole different world. We were able to, so we can say, oh, just do this, but of course it's not the same. I was an English major. Hank Paulson was, I think, 1 year ahead of me, 1 year behind me. He was an English major, obviously Secretary of the Treasury, ran Goldman Sachs, et cetera, but he didn't have to worry about being an economics major. Okay, now you fast forward to today, and you have a really difficult problem. How do we solve? By the way, I have kids who've just recently been through all this. How do you get through it? This is a problem. If you just focus on getting the job, you're going to end up eventually being quite dissatisfied because you probably, because you've got this, you haven't, we've just gone through what happens when you change your brain. You haven't really changed your brain. If you change your brain, you're on what some people call the scenic route. And how do you get back into the job market? The sophisticated, and I don't think schools are getting there, but I think, word to the wise, sophisticated schools have to figure out how to do both. They have to figure out how to do both. They have to figure out how to make the compromises. So they really do train enough of the core that you have that to build on. We did a study when we were looking at Ford, and we tried to figure out what percent of real serious learning occurred among a pretty wide range of people after they graduated from college. And we discovered, we can look at different ranges of numbers, but about of the serious learning, about 95 or 6% of it is over when you leave college. The learning you do thereafter is kind of vocational learning. And so you have to train people so they can keep learning on their own. And then the challenge is the schools really have to do this. They do have to deal with the world we're dealt with today. And so we have to figure out vocationally how to get adequate skills, how to get the schools so they're in the right echelon, so they're going to be, noticed. And so that has to happen. It's very difficult. It's very difficult because the central problem, David's got his hand up, the central problem is the hiring process. I know because I always was involved in the hiring process. And I'd look through it and, it's people that got thrown out. I wouldn't look at the ones we hired, I'd look at the ones you got thrown out. And the quirky people were always the most talented people. It just happened over and over and over again, at all levels. It's just so obvious, but they don't fit, a pattern. So you got to find. I mean, you will find people that are going to look for that, but it's difficult. The scenic route is tough, but it's a whole different world because you are a completely different person if you can understand things.
Thank you, Tom. A question here, and then we've got one here, and that might wrap it up. There's Bruce.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the closing point of Tom's opening session where he talked about AI. And I ask this as someone who was engaged in AI research 40 years ago. The way that AI will conquer humanity is we will give it the authority to do so. We have seen recently that humanity hasn't evolved at all. People got scared 5 years ago and went straight to authoritarianism. My fear is that the next or the one after that, time that comes around, rather than being a couple of government bureaucrats, the authority will be the AI system that's considered hundreds of thousands of variables and trillions of scenarios, and no one will be allowed to argue with it. Now, this comes from a culture that values compliance and risk aversion above all. The antidote has to come from a study of humanities and the social sciences. It has to come from there. So my question is, how do we reignite the humanities in a way that actually restructures our culture, that teaches people that it's important to question and respect authority simultaneously? Because our allegedly educated class, our credential class, were the worst of the worst 5 years ago. They were worse than the workers.
Who wants it?
Look, every freshman now, in addition to reading something like the Odyssey, should have a philosophical and not just philosophical introduction to the ethics of what's going to happen if we get to the singularity. I mean, it's insane not to do this. I mean, a few years ago, yeah, people didn't really care. Then people started to care about, plagiarism and so on and so forth. But I mean, that's Mickey Mouse compared to what is, and you know this, of course, much better than I do, Bruce, to what's coming up. You really want to get the humanities going, have a required course or a required half course or something like this, presumably run out of philosophy, but with people from computer science and philosophy and history and engineering and so on to talk about what's going to happen when your human world is no longer the humanities, right? I started by saying basically everything is the humanities, but this is the point at which the humanities is dead and cannot be recovered from, and we have to guard against that.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Please do not blame Tom for this question. And I realize where I'm asking it. You had said that you feel very strongly about a liberal arts curriculum. But in my mind, I see the picture of the dump truck with books from New College that went to the dump after DeSantis changed the leadership. Can you tell me that you now support a liberal?
Not only do I now, and this is, apologize to our panelists, this one's for me, but it's a great question, and it is a part of the narrative of newspapers and misunderstanding of facts. The library dean put forward a culling plan for those books, 90% of which were moldy from a roof leak, had nothing to do, 95% of them had nothing to do with the content of those books. And I can tell you, the librarian who did that, who no longer works here for this reason, asked council's opinion on how to do this and was told explicitly in an email, now is not the time to do this, and there are 2 statutes with which you must comply in order to do it, one for book disposition, one for books to give them away. And I actually walked by the library the week that happened and saw the dumpster, and I thought, thank God they're finally fixing the roof. So it was a confluence of errors, but I can assure you, and under no circumstances were any of those books authorized to be disposed of, although many of them were moldy and will need to be still. Nobody in the administration, at the provost's office or in the president's office, knew anything about it until we got to read about it in the newspaper or to field questions for it. It was very, very unfortunate. But no, there is nobody here who thought that was a good idea. It was a terrible look for us, and thank you for asking, and hopefully we got to clear the air a little bit. So thank you very much. And one more question.
Can I make a comment on
Sure.
what Bruce was saying?
Yep.
My view, Bruce, by the way, when we had these weekends, recruiting weekends, another one we did was an 18th century weekend. When you study these characters in the 18th century, quite a wide range of them, what you discover is they're all extremely well educated in many fields, not just, Jefferson's one example because obviously he was an architect, he was a statesman, he was a scientist, many, many fields, and you can go down, in Europe there's many, many more people. The dialogue that relates to AI will have to be conducted by people who understand the humanities and they understand AI. That's the only way it gets balanced. I've gone to so many graduations and I wanted to run up to the podium and then turn around and face the faculty and say to the faculty, you have been so specialized for so long. The problem is this hyper-specialization. The young minds have to realize it's such an obvious point, lateral thinking. I won't comment on a particular executive I'm working with, but I can see the failure of thinking. You can just spot it. The only way that you can actually think deeply is you do have to master enough. And by the way, it's not impossible, because you can learn the general principles relatively quickly, and probably quicker now than ever. They are, of course, many, many more, but the fact that so-called knowledge is doubling every whatever it is, some people say 12 hours, et cetera, it's not really doubling, because the fundamental points aren't doubling at all. The fundamental points aren't changing too much. In fact, the mathematics, you go through a machine learning textbook, and you'll discover most of the mathematics, I actually took the 8 mathematics higher level courses at Harvard Business School. The mathematics we learned there are still the same mathematics that are in machine learning. So you can understand all this, and you can have a dialogue, and you absolutely cannot delegate to experts in these subfields. That's the biggest mistake.
Thank you, Tom. One question here, sir.
You know, I went to, just so you know, to Columbia and Berkeley as a graduate student, and I had this whole liberal education that you're talking about. You see my white hair, so that tells you when all that happened. But now we're living in a completely different world. I had a reading, you know, a talking words education, just like you described, sir. And when I got out of Columbia, or Berkeley, really, I got, wow, I don't know anything about how to be a person. I don't know anything about ordinary people. I only know about this high-level mental thing, and it was wonderful. And I'm a great lateral thinker and a real quirky, very hard to hire guy, and didn't get hired. I had to find my own profession in order to make it work as a video producer. Okay, so I'm saying we're in this completely different world with the media nonstop and AI, but we don't have humanity. We got the humanities, but we don't have humanity. And I suggest, Tom, that we, you keep using the word we, humanity, are not deciding anything. It's being decided for us by the tiny few. We see the current in Washington, you know, 13 billionaires. They are deciding. We are not deciding. And humanity, what's good for humanity, nobody's considering that. It's about money, power, success, the whole hierarchy. What humanity needs simply hasn't mattered. But humanity exists, and humanity is coming into an incredible level of empowerment through the global brain connecting. And so a new ethic for what Earth needs, Gaia needs, they don't worry about that either, those guys, and what we need to be everybody benefit, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals, that all the governments of the world have agreed to provide their populations by 2030. And if that became what we were working on doing as a societies and global society, everything would change. And we know what we're doing as humanity.
Reaction?
Well, first of all, I know David quite well, and David is playing a game called See If You Can Find the Question. But he's a brilliant guy, and he's discussing a very, very real problem. And so David went to Columbia, and he went through the core, as one of my sons did. And I've talked to David many times about this. So I don't think nobody on this stage knows the answer, David, I'm sure. But it does involve, in my view, broad education, right? And somehow, some way, the scenic route has to eventually get there. Because what happens in these careers is, and you just see it so clearly, when people are about 40 years old, there's an enormous difference in people. They can have the same resume. They can go to whatever, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Cornell. They can go to Harvard Business School. They can go to Wharton, et cetera. But when they're 40 years old, the ones that have imagination are totally different. I know because I'm advising a guy who runs his new CEO, and we just went through the top 12 people the other day. And I mean, it's very, very clear the 2 or 3 that are different from the others. Now, if you study them, they're just like the authors. Why are they different? Because they built the base. They spent the time to think about a wide range of things. And that's what creates the imagination. There's no secret to it. It's just a lot of hard work. I don't think the world's totally changed. It just has a little more tech in it. But I don't think it's really changed. The fundamentals are still the same.
David, I did say that we have an audience full of Socratic stage guests, so another day, but thank you. Great points. What a beautiful audience. This has been an incredible opportunity for me to share some time with some amazing intellects who not only have shared their knowledge with us, but also a great deal of wisdom as well. So we thank you both for being a part of this. And to our audience in particular, I want to note that there are a few faculty members here tonight, and in my discussions with these two gentlemen, I think at least every other conversation we had about their education and their upbringing, they mentioned a great teacher. So understand that your impact on young men and women are making a difference in this country, and we thank you for what you do for our country, but also for New College. And we have some amazing faculty here. And I will say that, Dr. Katz, I believe we are one of those places that does it differently. We deliver a product that is really a graduate level style education, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 students in a class. Versus a big lecture hall where you don't know anybody and you're taught by a TA. We have a very unique product here. It is expensive, but it's worth it. and we're the third and soon growing to be one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest state in the country. We are a powerhouse politically as a state. The state of Florida deserves a great liberal arts college, and we are that, and we thank you for your support tonight. Thank you so much for being here, and again to the Markowitz, thank you so much.